Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be discussing ancient Greek atomism. Now, the ancient Greek atomists are a really kind of disparate tradition in some ways, and they're really philosophically and scientifically quite fascinating. We've been discussing a lot of, pre-Socratic philosophers and them giving material principles for the universe. So, as you might recall, Thales thought that the entire universe was composed of water, right? And Epicurus, by contrast, characterized the entire world as composed of fire, right? And what makes the ancient Greek atomists so interesting is that they were, at least in reference to our contemporary scientific standards, quite close to what the modern scientific image really tells us that the universe is like. And so the atomists are interesting in particular as these really ancient representatives of what we would now identify as a natural scientific tradition and approach to life and reality. Now, we're going to be discussing some important differences between, say, the ancient Greek atomists and modern natural scientists of the sort like Galileo and Newton and so on, right? However, there are also very, very exciting similarities, and it also produces an extremely interesting ethical doctrine that we're going to be discussing in the next video, where we're going to be discussing Epicurus's letter to Menoetius. In this video, we're looking at Epicurus's letter to Herodotus. So, as usual, beginning on the left and then moving to the right, there are three important founders that we might think of as belonging to the tradition of ancient Greek atomism. One of these, at least, probably two, honestly, should be familiar to you. The first one is Democritus, who is one of the pre-Socratic philosophers that we discussed. So, it's really quite interesting that even prior to Socrates, we have some articulation of the view that really reality, all of the stuff in the universe, is composed of physical atoms. And that's, a very interesting, shocking, very philosophically sophisticated statement for that time. Now, Democritus, he came a little bit before the main figure that we're going to be reading, who is Epicurus. Epicurus actually founded a philosophical school in Athens. He had disciples. He had disciples not only in Greece, but actually across both Greece and Rome. There were people that would espouse, Epicurean philosophy. And it's really with Epicurus, more than any other figure, that we have this sort of blossoming of atomistic philosophy. Democritus is an important precursor to Epicurus, but it's really with Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy that we get a really robust, systematic picture of what the atomistic viewpoint looks like and entails. Now, this is going to be, again, something familiar to you already at this point in the course. However, the amount of extant material that we have of Epicurus is quite low in comparison with the supposedly voluminous material that he ended up writing. We have only a few fragments, really. We have, the two letters that you're going to be reading and some sayings that were passed down from Epicureans. But really, that's it. We don't have a big philosophical work in the same way that we have, the Republic or something like that, right? Or Aristotle's Metaphysics, right? That is an example of a big philosophical book and not a short letter that can really expound things in significant detail. Now, Epicurus wrote a book like that. We believe it was called On Nature. We know of its existence because other people, especially Epicureans, would discuss it and write about it. But we have no version of this manuscript, unfortunately, right? So the little bits that we do have of Epicurus, because he preferred speech to writing, and he preferred to train disciples rather than, write books or something like that, is quite limited. And this is why we also rely on a third source, who's actually not even Greek, but he's Roman, Lucretius. Lucretius was an Epicurean a few hundred years later, during actually one of the most tumultuous periods of Roman history. And he wrote this really beautiful epic poem called On the Nature of Things. And it's really unique because it is, to my knowledge, one of the only philosophical works that's written as an epic poem. So, Lucretius wrote in the vein of Homer and Hesiod and, so on, right? But he didn't seek to tell a story or anything like that. Instead, he expounds on the details of the sort of atomistic picture that we're going to be painting today. So really with these three founders, with Democritus, you find the sort of like early seeds of this viewpoint. In Epicurus, you see it sort of expounded into a philosophical system, like a really rigorous one for the first time. And then Lucretius is really helpful in terms of he gives us a lot more detail, a lot more, very, very specific points about the Epicurean viewpoint. So, like, one thing you might ask is, like, well, okay, we know we're talking about an atomistic tradition and we're going to talk more about what atoms are, but you might have questions like, how big are atoms? Do they have various different shapes? How many shapes of atoms are there, right? Things like that are not exactly really fully answered in the letter to Herodotus that we read together and are discussing together now, but Lucretius's epic poem gives very detailed and refined answers to these sorts of questions. So, if you found this very interesting and you would like to read more, I highly recommend that you check out some Lucretius, because after this week, you'll have read most of what is available to us from Epicurus. Okay, so we've kind of discussed their founders, here are these historical founders, here are the available texts that we have from these founders, right? We haven't really discussed what atomism is yet to this point, and so we're moving to this little quadrant right here. In the fundamental thesis of ancient Greek atomism, in particular, this is Epicurus, right? So it might not fully fit Democritus, but still, I think it gives you a fully fleshed out view of what this atomistic tradition is trying to say. And their fundamental thesis is that there are two fundamental constituent elements of the universe. There's matter and void. Those are the two fundamental things in the universe. Now, of course, there are tables and chairs and people and drawers and desks and so on, right? All of the things of our everyday life, coffee, whatever. Epicurus isn't going to say, those things are an illusion or something like that. That's actually something that Democritus would say. Democritus says, we see chairs and tables and books and so on, these everyday ordinary objects. But really, that's an illusion. What, we would see if we could see things correctly is just atoms, right? Marx actually wrote his philosophical dissertation about the difference between Democritus and Epicurus, and actually wrote in favor of the Epicurean view before he got all interested in politics and in political economy and economics and started talking about capitalism and so on, right? That really happened when he met Engels. Before that, he had a philosophy PhD, and what his philosophy PhD was about was the difference between Democritus and Epicurus. Now, Epicurus, what he is going to say is, there are, chairs and tables and books and so on, the objects of your everyday life, but they are composed of matter. So, um, in other words, books and tables and chairs and so on, the things of our everyday experience, they are not fundamental or simple, right? They are made up of other stuff, right? And this is a pretty basic insight. If you tear a page out of a book, right, you could say the book is in some way composed of its parts that are, the pages, among other things, right? So matter and void, right? We got to discuss these two terms together to really get a sense of like what does it mean to really just say that there's matter and void. That sounds like really epic, or metal or something, right? But what does that actually mean? Well, matter is the visible stuff of experience, right? This is matter, that's matter, books are matter, tables, chairs, etc. are matter, right? But in Epicurus's view, all of the material stuff in the universe is composed of atoms, right? And this is what, an atomistic philosophy is. Atoms are, by definition, the indivisible elements of all material stuff, right? It's worth pausing for a moment to compare this conception of an atom with our, sort of like contemporary scientific picture of what an atom looks like. If you recall your physics class in high school or something like that, you might recall that, our conception of atoms now is that atoms are composed of various subatomic particles, right? I mean, you have a proton, a neutron, an electron, right? And these particles ultimately compose the atom, right? But atom, in its ancient Greek sense, means that which can't be split any further, right? Atoms are supposed to be, for the atomist, sort of the bedrock foundation, right? You can cut a table, you can cut a book, you can cut a computer, mouse, or a monitor, or any of those things in half, and you can keep going further and further and further and further, right? Until the atomists believe you'll hit a point at which you can cut no further. That these are the simple stuff, that all of the more complex stuff that we see around us is made up of, right? Now, why believe in the existence of these atoms, and how are they different from the contemporary scientific perspective? Well, the contemporary scientific perspective, we thought at one point that atoms were the smallest elementary components of the universe, but then we increased our scientific capabilities and so on, and we found various particles that are even smaller than atoms, right? And so, as a consequence, we sort of abandoned the conception of atoms as it was developed in the ancient Greek tradition, and really, started to say, okay, well, maybe the basic stuff of the universe isn't atoms, but it's quarks, but it's, right, all of these even smaller components. Okay, but what that would mean, if you were Epicurus or you were an ancient Greek, right, you would just say, well, you scientists messed up, right? You located something of a certain size. You thought it couldn't be divided any further, right? Turns out it can be divided further. It has even smaller parts, right? Nuclear reactions, the splitting of an atom, and so on, right? They erroneously believed that these things that are made up of a proton, a neutron, and an electron were atoms, were the smallest stuff in the universe. But really, atoms are indivisible. Atoms are not supposed to admit of any kind of division whatsoever, and so the atomists could not accept our contemporary scientific vision of what an atom is, right? And so the sort of like necessary components to their existing various kinds of atoms is that there's what Epicurus calls void. And void, I've written here, is the necessary condition for movement in the universe. Now, the argument, given really more by Lucretius than Epicurus, though it occurs in Epicurus in some ways, they believe at this point they've established more or less that the material things that we encounter in our everyday experience are made of matter. Okay. The next step then is to introduce the condition for matter to change, because matter does change, right? Matter enters into different kinds of configurations, right? I can tear apart the book. I can, cut various objects, right? I can slice an apple and thereby change the composite nature of that entity, right, to be composed of two distinct parts. So it must be possible for atoms to move, right? For atoms to change their relationship and their positions with respect to one another, right? Atoms might appear like banana-wise or pear-wise or apple-wise, right? But then it gets eaten, it gets cut, right? All these things can happen to it, and it changes, right? And so Epicurus and the Epicureans maintain that void is the necessary condition of movement in the universe. And now I've tried to draw here, and my drawing skills, leave a lot to be desired, but nevertheless, I've tried to draw here a jar, right? And that jar is full of marbles, right? And that might be the most obvious thing that you would say about it. Say it's a jar full of marbles or whatever. People guess the quantity of marbles. They do various things with jars of marbles, right? But one thing that you can do with that jar of marbles is you can pick it up and you can shake it, right? If you shake the jar of marbles, then more likely than not, if you haven't compacted them so much that they don't admit of any movement whatsoever, you'll hear the marbles clacking against one another, right? As they change their positions relative to one another. And so importantly, in the case where they're not so compacted together and you do achieve movement, then what that indicates is that there was not only matter in that jar, right? But there was also void. There was the spaces in between the marbles, right? Marbles are a spherical shape, right? So they're not going to exactly fill up the entirety of the jar in the way that like a liquid would, right? And so what allows the marbles to move around with respect to one another is that there's sufficient space in the jar, right? And so the Epicureans thought, okay, there are these elementary particles, elementary stuff of the universe, that's atoms. Those atoms move around, they change their relationships to one another, they enter into composites of various kinds. Those composites change, they can be destroyed, but the individual elements don't get destroyed. Atoms remain the same, they just change their relationship with one another. In the same way that when you shake up the jar full of marbles, the marbles don't crack or change or anything like that, they simply change their position with respect to one another, right? They enter into different kinds of relationships. And this is meant to be a model for thinking about the entirety of the universe, right? And now this is like really, really close in some ways to a modern natural scientific perspective. So what is Epicurean's relationship to modern natural science? If you think about Descartes, for example, Descartes says, if you give me matter and motion, I will create for you a universe, right? And in a way, you can say that this statement by Descartes, which is really a statement about the capacity of modern physics to explain the world, really, it harkens back in some way to this Epicurean picture, right? He said, give me matter and motion, right? Void is the condition for motion on the Epicurean's picture. Descartes doesn't so much like this void business. He does away with it in ways that are interesting, but not the subject of this class, right? And so you can kind of see, instead of thinking like there are forms out there and there's a form of the good and the world is organized by this form, by the substantial forms and so on, they think everything is material, right? Epicurus is an important inspiration for many natural scientists because he's committed to natural explanations of the world. Now, where this really comes out for Epicurus is in a kind of way that is very surprising for us as contemporary readers. It's in his analysis of climate and weather. Right? Why would that be important? Well, get into the attitude of an ancient Greek, right? You're talking 2,000 years ago. You're talking prior to us giving like really good natural scientific accounts of, okay, here's what a cloud is, here's what rain is, here's what hail is, here's what thunder, lightning, etc. are, right? We don't have anything like a natural scientific explanation of meteorological phenomena, right? But if the Epicurean view is right, then the normal everyday attitude that a Greek might have about the weather must be wrong, right? Ancient Greek might think, if they see lightning or something like that, or they see a high tide, they think, oh, Lord, we must have pissed off Zeus or Poseidon, right? This stuff's got to come from somewhere, right? It probably comes from these supernatural gods, right? And so that would be an example of like a supernatural explanation. Okay, there's this thing in nature, like rain, thunder, high tide, and so on, right? You're looking for the cause of that phenomena, right? And what ordinary everyday people do is they give a supernatural explanation of that phenomena, whereas Epicurus is committed to giving a natural explanation, right? It's all matter and void. You shake up matter, you get in the right conditions, and it will form a lightning bolt, it will form thunder, it will form hail, rain, and so on. And so Epicurus and the Epicureans, they were really committed to trying to develop a naturalistic way of explaining the weather and climate, because they saw that people's tendency towards these supernatural explanations brought about a lot of suffering on their part, right? Because, if you think that the cause of the high tide is Zeus or Poseidon or what have you, right? Then you believe that in some way it's kind of your fault, right? If Zeus is pissed off, you must have done your offerings wrong. If Poseidon is upset, you must have displayed, some kind of hubris or something to be worthy of punishment, right? But on Epicurus's picture of the world, as well as our natural scientific view, no, right? The weather, various phenomena of that sort, they're just caused by atoms and motion. There's no direct responsibility on our part for any of these events. And we shouldn't organize our lives by this kind of superstition. Oh, am I going to piss off, the dude that makes lightning? or whatever, right? And you can kind of live in tranquility. Oh, none of this is a punishment towards me. None of this is an indication I'm doing anything wrong, right? It's just the way that the world is. And so as a result, Epicurus is also an empiricist, right? He thinks that what philosophy is meant to do is to give a good account of the things that we see and that we hear and that we experience, right? One of Epicurus's arguments for the existence of atoms that actually I think comes from Democritus originally is he says something like, just wake up early one morning, view the streams of sunlight as they enter into a room or a building, and what you'll see are various, we would now know that they're like dust and so on, right? Particles moving about the air in a way that you can't normally see or sense or experience in any way whatsoever. And so what they conclude from that is, well, this must be happening in all sorts of conditions in which we can't, directly see the small particles as they travel throughout the air and so on, right? And so Epicurus always tries to base his arguments on sense experience, right? We know that matter can move, can enter into different configurations because we witness movement all the time, right? And so to be an empiricist in this way just means that he's following the data as best he can that we get from sensory experience. However, the way that, Epicurus is nevertheless still an ancient Greek is he does not have something like a scientific method, right? Epicurus is not interested in the natural world for its own sake, right? He is not interested in trying to give like predictive accounts of the weather, to give predictive accounts of really anything that, we might find. He's not conducting experiments, he's not doing tests, right? And that's because he doesn't view the point of any of this as giving predictions, making experiments, developing a scientific image of the world or something like that, right? He sees all of this inquiry into nature as having an ethical and political purpose, primarily ethical, right? And what he thinks that it does, he thinks, okay, well, if you know that the universe is composed of matter and void, then you're not likely to fall into superstition. That you're not likely to think that, if you think that there are gods out there and those gods can suffer and they suffer by you not worshiping them correctly, right? Then you can believe, okay, I must dedicate my whole life to worship. I have to make sure that I follow all of the rituals correctly. I need to make sure that we have a polis, right? A social and political community that is in some ways appealing to the gods as we know them, right? And in a way, you structure your whole life around this idea of there being gods and there being gods that you have to appease. And on the Epicurean picture, gods, just in virtue of being gods, want for nothing. They're perfect, right? They don't need you. They don't need human beings. They don't need worship in any way at all, right? They can't be hurt by anything that happens in the world, right? This is in contrast to like Homer, right, where Athena or various other gods, Hera, right, get very offended or hurt by things that happen in the human world. Epicurus thinks if you think philosophically, then you can dispel all of those worries, right? You'll learn the world operates according to natural scientific laws. It's, that are basically about matter and motion, and that, the world is not ordered according to the purposes of a supernatural God. And so you don't need to live your life in service to such a God. And so, in this way, the Epicureans, much like the Stoics and really all of the ancient Greeks, saw the study of nature not as important for its own sake, but important for the spiritual enlightenment of the soul, right? It's precisely by learning about nature and its operations that then I can adjust my own expectations, my own life, my own practice, my own ascesis, as we've been talking about, towards the way that the world really is, right? Hence, Epicurus will tell his followers, remind yourself always that there is only matter and void, right? And the idea is that if you take this natural account of the world very seriously, then it can do great good for your soul. Okay, and now for the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that ethical aspect of Epicureanism in much more depth by explicitly focusing on Epicurus's account of death and why he thinks if you take this account seriously, you should not fear death. And because you do not fear death, you are, on his account, more powerful than you were otherwise. In fact, he promises to make you more powerful than a god, right? Or at least as gods are normally depicted. And so that's a very enticing claim that we will have to explore in the next video. Thank you so much. I hope this was interesting to you all.